Hi, I'm Hamish Black, and welcome to Writing on Games. It'll probably surprise none of my regular viewers to know that I am unbelievably excited for From Software's upcoming release Dark Souls 3. Hell, Dark Souls 1 helped me cope with major depression, and revisiting Demon's Souls after becoming enraptured with its follow-up illustrated just how fully realised these games can be. Their worlds are consistently beautiful, even at their most macabre. Their lore is deep and respects the player's intelligence enough not to shove it in the player's face. The action is about as visceral and perfectly tuned as action games can possibly be, and whilst the player's losses are hammered home time and time again, their achievements and victories are made even more apparent. Essentially, every single micro element of these games felt like they were placed with the most acute precision, and judging by trailers and gameplay footage released by Bandai Namco, it looks like Dark Souls 3 will mark a grand return to this truly artistic level of world building and weighty action, with perhaps a slightly darker vibe, potentially taken from the last FromSoft release Bloodborne, a game which, sadly, I have been unable to play due to my lack of a console to play it on. Notice how one game in this venerable series has yet to be mentioned here, and how I use the term grand return to describe the upcoming release. That game, as the more astute viewers may have already guessed, probably by looking at the title of the video, is 2014's Dark Souls 2. I can say without a doubt that Dark Souls 2 is one of the most disappointing games I have ever played. And I say this having played through the original release once, and having only recently begun playing through Scholar of the First Sin, whilst also having completed Dark Souls multiple times, so take that all for what it's worth. It's not bad per se, just disappointing. That distinction is important, because if Dark Souls 2 had been released without the baggage that comes with following perhaps the most fully realised game of all time, then it could have at the very least been considered an above average action RPG. Whilst none of the features present in the game retained the polish that so elevated the other games, the combat still feels relatively weighty and largely feels more involved than many of its contemporaries. That said, there were many elements of Dark Souls 2's design that left me genuinely confused as to who thought their implementation would be beneficial to the game as a whole. So many deliberate design decisions seem to illustrate that without previous director Hidetaka Miyazaki's input and his subsequent return to the series in both Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, the team simply did not understand what made those games tick on an absolutely fundamental level. In this episode of Writing on Games then, I want to attempt to break down as much as possible why this game left me longing for the older games. In order to exemplify all of this, it's important to break the games down into their key components and examine why they so worked in previous installments, and why the system updates present in Dark Souls 2 didn't. To begin, let's discuss arguably the main thing that draws people to these games in the first place, the action. In many critiques of the game, I have seen much ephemera used to describe the action in Dark Souls 2. How it just didn't feel right, or the action just wasn't as immersive or fun. Whilst I believe that these assertions are largely correct, I also believe that there is evidence to back up the idea that the way the combat encounters were designed in 2 did not lend themselves well to what many believe the core tenets of the series to be. One of the key areas where I felt this to be most prevalent was in the enemy placement of all things. The beauty of Dark Souls is that the player never feels fully prepared for what's to come in an area their first time through, and it feels like anything could happen at any moment. Yet every enemy is placed very specifically in order to test the player's skills in a number of different ways. In one way, this precise placement of enemies is what allows the game to truly teach the player what they need to know mechanically in order to best the obstacles their next time through, as the enemies all return to their original states, allowing the player to better prepare for the encounter after they die. For example, take the first time the player sets foot in Lordran at the Firelink Shrine. The player has many options as to where they can go, yet the way the quote-unquote correct route is illustrated to the player is almost entirely through its enemy placement. If the player goes down towards New Londo, for example, their progress is halted by an ambush of ghosts that they won't be able to attack without a certain item. If they head towards the catacombs, they will be ambushed by skeletons that are likely to be significantly more powerful than the player at this early stage. Not only this, but if the player does decide to persist down this route or simply choose to run past it, they will be greeted with more and more skeleton ambushes as they progress, eventually leading to a cluster of skeletons, as well as a couple of huge ones that will likely kill the player in one hit. If ever there was a clearer indication of I might be going down the wrong way here, I have yet to see it in a game. Then, when you do hit upon the correct path up the stairs towards the undead burg, you are greeted immediately with what you will face in this situation. There is no ambush here. simply one enemy placed after another, clearly visible to the player as soon as they reach the location. The player takes on the first enemy to find that this enemy is unquestionably weaker than the enemies on the other paths, giving them a better idea of what to expect going forward on this one. There is an item hanging from a corpse next to a slightly more armoured enemy, and as you approach you discover that the enemy above you is throwing firebombs down your way, suggesting that in order to get this item, you will have to either take a risk or deal with the threats first. When you discover that you can aggro the armoured enemy to a point where the firebombs no longer affect you, you can take him out, albeit with slightly more effort, than previous enemies. As you progress up the stairs, you find yourself confronted with a group of weaker enemies. A slight escalation of challenge, but the game only requires that you prioritise enemies based on their position and risk to the player. They share the same design, so there is a visual indication that they will all follow the same set of rules as each other, meaning that all the player has to do is manage the situation slightly differently. After this, they can progress to the Undead Burg, with the indication that they are on the right track, and they have also learned important dynamics in terms of combat between individual enemies and groups of enemies. None of the other options are locked off to the player in terms of where they can go, but everything about the enemy placement suggests that this is where the designers wanted you to focus your attention at this early stage. Compare this situation to early encounters in Dark Souls 2, whereas with Dark Souls 1, at least early on, enemy ambushes are used as a means to deter the player from continuing down a path that will likely get them killed time and time again. In Dark Souls 2, the areas that aren't just straight up blocked off by rocks or statues almost seem to use ambush as their primary means of assaulting the player. If you decide to head towards Heidi's Tower of Flame, for instance, it is easy to see what lies ahead of you, but these enemies are huge and take a lot of hits to beat, so the game doesn't exactly encourage you to take this path. However, take the path towards the Forest of the Fallen Giants, and the circumstances change only slightly. This whole area thrives on bombarding you with enemies that you have very little chance to see coming, and so it is easy to become overwhelmed. This is only exacerbated when you climb the ladder to the more open courtyard and see huge amounts of corpses lying around which come to life as you get close to them, meaning that as you're trying to deal with one group of enemies, it's highly likely that another will spring to life and begin attacking you as well. This is the technique implemented in Dark Souls 1 in order to discourage newer players from heading towards the catacombs, one of the most difficult areas of the game. Difference is, this is one of the opening areas of Dark Souls 2, and is one of the few ways you can actually go at the start of the game. With the emphasis placed on ambushing the player in 2, it ends up feeling like some kind of jump scare riddled trash flick compared to the first game's more somber horror experience that truly gets under your skin. On top of this, whilst the enemies are still relatively low level, they don't stagger nearly as easily as the early enemies in Dark Souls 1, whilst you can be staggered in as little as a couple of hits. Now this is actually an interesting point, as one of the key differences for me between Dark Souls 1 and 2 is the level of fairness. Again, much ephemera is spouted about the first game's harsh but fair nature, which again is absolutely true, but I think it goes deeper than that tagline alone. The way enemies stagger compared to the player is actually one of the biggest indicators of fairness within the two games. In the first game, if you hit an enemy and they had their shield up, you would either be staggered yourself or suffer a massive penalty in terms of stamina, leaving you at least partially open to a counterattack. Thing is, the enemies were just as open to this risk themselves. One of the most effective strategies for some early enemies is to goad them into attacking, only to stagger themselves and leave themselves open to a player counter. The enemies follow the same rules as the player does in Dark Souls 1. This is why the game is considered to be so fair. Even with the Ornstein and Smo fight later on, one of the most difficult boss battles in the history of gaming, the tension and anxiety comes from the fact that you now have to manage two very different bosses as opposed to just one. It's a way to test the player on enemy management and prioritization between dodging and attacking, rather than just two powerful enemies with longer health bars than most. And this is also exemplified by the fact that the first half of the battle is arguably far more difficult than the second when you only have to fight one of them. The enemies never cheat, and as I've stated in previous videos, difficulty is not the be-all and end-all of the Souls series. In Dark Souls 2, however, it often feels as if the enemies follow a completely different rule set to the player, rarely opening themselves up to counterattacks, whilst bombarding the player with flurries of their own. And at an early stage, the player can only effectively block a few of these hits before their stamina runs out and they become staggered. Layer on top of this the fact that it takes more souls to level up in 2 than in 1, and you are at a clear statistical disadvantage between games. This isn't even to mention the way enemy placement was handled in the game's re-release, Scholar of the First Sin. This was supposed to fix many of the issues people had with the initial release, but for me only ended up exacerbating them. For example, in Dark Souls 1 it would feel incredibly off if suddenly the amount of enemies in an area, or where they were placed, was changed in any way. As I have stated previously, every enemy feels as if it is placed there for a reason, and it usually comes down to minutely tuning the exact challenge the player will face at any given point. If you head to Forest of the Fallen Giants in the second game, however, you'll find that there are quite simply random enemies placed there in Scholar of the First Sin, including one that, especially early in the game in the initial release, would be near impossible to beat. Make your way to the more open area up the ladder and there are far more enemies, as well as one of the White Knight guys taken away from the area. Head to Heidi's Tower of Flame and suddenly there are a whole bunch of these White Knight guys that weren't there before. Why are they there? What purpose do they serve narratively? Why do they not aggro unless attacked first? It is not made clear to the player, and so their placement in the re-release when they weren't in that area at all to begin with just makes the design of the game feel inconsistent, as if any enemy could just be forced in at any point for the sake of difficulty. It's as if the developers of the second game looked at the marketing push for the first game, saw how well the idea of a difficult game with "prepare to die" as its slogan resonated with masochists complaining about too much hand-holding in modern games, and thought, we need to up the ante, as opposed to examining why that difficulty was implemented both mechanically and thematically in the first place. Which brings me on to my final point, the ways in which both games handle the idea of difficulty in terms of their plots and general tone. If you watched my last video on Dark Souls, you'll know that I posit that the game actually maintains a pretty celebratory tone, rather than merely wallowing in the macabre. This is apparent for many reasons. For example, the way the game handles death is far different to the way its sequel deals with the concept. The key to Dark Souls 1 is that the world ultimately is grossly indifferent to your presence, and the reason you are fighting through this harsh world is to gain enough agency over your own existence to recognise triumph as well as failure, and appreciate the little moments in life. Death is trivialised. It happens so much and the enemies trudge so lethargically back to their positions after cutting you down that it almost takes on a humorous quality. This means that when the player succeeds, however, it is highlighted by the game, whether that be through a moment of precious respite from combat, or a new area to explore, or an item. These occur just rarely enough and are brought about solely by player skill. Remember, all enemies in Dark Souls 1 follow a set of rules just like you do. That when the player wins, the sense of accomplishment is palpable. The world is so consumed by death that when life penetrates that, it becomes incredible. This, in turn, encourages the player to keep going. This is why, as I have previously argued, the game is such an effective allegory for depression and how to cope with it or overcome it, even if it seems insignificant at first. Dark Souls 2, on the other hand, from the very start, illustrates to the player a complete misunderstanding of the tone of those previous games. Like I say, it feels like the developers thought that more difficult meant better game, and this is clear from the piss-poor excuse for narrative at the start of the game. You are told at the very start of the game, with what feels like scraps out of a particularly emotional teenager's poetry journal, that like a moth to a flame your wings will burn in anguish, as that is the fate of the cursed. It hammers home the inevitability of succumbing to your curse, which, if we're looking at the idea of being cursed as allegorical to suffering from major depression, can actually be seen as kind of dangerous. The women in the house laugh at you, talking to you like a child as if they understand your condition far better than you ever could. It insinuates that the idea of trying to fight is absolutely futile, before laughing at the idea that you could possibly survive in this world, and that you will lose the very thing that makes you feel like you've conquered something, your souls, over and over again, before descending into fits of laughter once again. It may sound like I'm being somewhat pedantic or looking into this too much, but this was genuinely one of the worst first impressions a game has ever left on me, and arguably soured the experience as a whole. Most of the NPCs in the first game, like the enemies, felt like they were operating on a similar emotional framework to the player. That is to say, regardless of whether they acted hostile or friendly, they were all informed by a sense of fear of losing themselves. And so for the most part, they encourage you to keep going. As the pyromancer you rescue from the depths says to you as you return to Firelink Shrine, and as expertly analysed by my fellow YouTuber Fork, whose video on Dark Souls you should definitely check out, don't you dare go hollow. The game and its characters want you to succeed, if only to show them that at the very least, someone in their predicament can succeed. Dark Souls 2, on the other hand, revels in the grim in a way that feels completely opposite to the message Dark Souls 1 communicates. As I previously stated, it feels like the enemies all follow completely different rule sets to you, and they can often overwhelm you in sheer numbers and without warning, and so overcoming them unscathed often feels like sheer luck rather than skill. This transition from luck to skill means that opposed to the first game, winning feels trivialised as opposed to losing. The developers, like the woman at the start of the game, laugh at the idea of you succeeding, and by pummeling you with hordes of stronger enemies, limiting your abilities through stats, renovating the healing system so that healing items are limited and you only start off with one Estus flask, modifying weapon durability so weapons can break well before the enemy numbers are depleted, and various other confusing mechanical and design decisions, the developers state in no uncertain terms that difficulty trumps all, regardless of what it's used for. As opposed to all the characters that tell you that they don't want to see you go hollow in the first game, everything about the second game suggests that that is all the game wants for you. The only way you can overcome any of this is if luck happens to favour you, and that is exactly the opposite of what I look for in a Souls game. So yeah, that's a very abridged version of the basic ways Dark Souls 2 got it wrong in my opinion. It's a slightly longer episode today, but only because I feel that there is so much to be said on this game and its place within the series. Like I say, I don't think it's a bad game necessarily, and there are certainly some mechanical elements that still place it above many contemporary RPGs in my mind, but within the canon of the Souls series, it just doesn't hold up. Hidetaka Miyazaki's absence as director for 2, and his return to the widely revered Bloodborne, suggests that without that singular vision at his helm, the developers completely missed the point of why these games are supposed to be difficult. It's important from a mechanical, design and narrative point of view. It permeates every element of the game's design. In 2, however, as opposed to merely informing the design, it felt like the primary objective. There was so much I didn't get to talk about here regarding world design and how you navigate the world and such, and I was only able to analyse a couple of early encounters in both games, but I feel they are both indicative of the larger issues here. I mean, I don't know, have I got this all wrong? I know of some defenders of the game, but I also know that the general consensus is that the game is disappointing. And as an aside, I'd highly recommend checking out Matthew Matosis and Matt Lee's videos on the subject for even more reasons as to why this game just didn't work. I'd be genuinely interested to know what you guys think, so leave a comment down below regarding your thoughts on the game, whether they be positive or negative. Anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and as another aside, thank you all so much for supporting the channel. New subscribers are coming in every day and I genuinely appreciate every one. If you like the videos, then if you considered sharing them with other people that you think might be able to take something from them, then I'd be eternally grateful. You guys give me the energy to keep doing this on at the very least a semi-regular basis, so thank you all so much. I know the channel is still relatively tiny compared to others, but that doesn't mean that your support means any less to me. Quite the opposite actually. In short, you guys are the fucking best. And with that said, I'm Hamish Black and that concludes yet another episode of Writing on Games. I'll see you next time.